John 10, beginning in verse 1. And there we read, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of the strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd." So we come to John chapter 10 this morning, and let us notice this morning an important fact, an important understanding as we come into this chapter. It's a continuation of the talk of blindness from John chapter 9. We come into this recognizing that Jesus is having a major teaching moment here. This is not just a standalone moment. This is not something that we come just to get a few nuggets of truth out, but Jesus is still gathered with the blind man from John chapter 9. He's still gathered with the leaders of the temple that he was talking to in John chapter 9. At the end, in the middle of the end of John chapter 9, he's still gathered with the Pharisees who were debating whether or not the man healed from his blindness in John chapter 9 was really the blind man, or was he some other man? It is important anytime that we gather to read Scripture, or whenever you study Scripture on your own, that you read it in context of itself. Now, I know that some of you have been reading Scripture for longer than I've been alive, but stick with me for just a moment. The whole just jumping in and jumping out of Scripture, just opening your Bible and starting to read wherever the pages turn to, while it may seem like it leads us to feel-good moments or realizations of God, it's really just opening and hoping that you land somewhere good. Really, when we understand the message of the gospel, when we understand the message of the Bible in light of itself, it's then that we begin to grasp the deity and the glory and the majesty of the King. And even in those moments when we feel like we just dive into our Bibles because life is beating us up, that is perhaps when we need most to come to God in context of Himself. That when we need to go know God and the true nature of the glory of God, not just nuggets, but the majesty and the glory of the King. So this morning when we come to John 10, we need to know the full story of what's going on here. We don't just need to jump in, try to grab a few nuggets and pull them out. We need to know the full context of what's happening here in John 10. I say all this because as we've been building this narrative, it's been continually building. John introduced us to Jesus in John chapter 1. It says, as the Word became flesh in John chapter 1, the Word became flesh, and through Him all things were created. Without Him, nothing was created that has been created. As we move forward, the revelation of the deity of Jesus continues to unfold as we look at the wedding feast. There, in that seemingly perhaps small moment, we are pointed forward to the cross. Because remember, we're talking about the wine at the wedding feast, and we're pointed forward to the cross when the blood of Jesus will be poured out, and the blood of Jesus represented at the communion table as the wine. But not just that, in that moment at the wedding feast, we're reminded that here at the wedding feast, Jesus creates something out of nothing as he creates the wine from nothing. And that is the beginning of the narrative as John is telling it. It develops with each word that passes. And today, as Jesus is again addressing the Pharisees and the leaders and the blind man, he's addressing them and their lack of faith, their desire to be a self-sustained, self-fulfilled, and self-appointed group of people. Jesus is addressing their self-righteousness, their appointed positions that they put themselves in, and their rejection of the gospel, while simultaneously their complete neglect for the caring of the people of God. Now follow with me here. The people of the temple, the leaders of the Jews, should be, their primary focus should be focusing on how do we care for people. Right? When we come to church, our focus is how do we care for the people of God? How do we understand? This morning when we're praying, how do we care for the people of God? How do we go about loving better? How do we go about being about knowing and having the heart of God? How do we go about worshiping and knowing and understanding how God has called us to be and what he's called us to do while we're here on this planet with the time that he's left us with? It's not just about coming together, having a feel-good moment and having a good community, but no, it's about how do we understand the heart? How do we understand how to love with the heart that he's giving us, and how do we go about leaving this place better, not just better people, because it's not about being better people, it's about having the heart of God and using that heart to be better influences and being an agent of change in the community that he's created us to be. So when we look at the end of chapter 9 and going into chapter 10, Jesus is using this as a moment to address the leaders of the temple. And he's saying, you're missing the heart. You're neglecting the care of the people of God, which is your main focus. It should be everything that you're about. But as we continually mention in John is reminding us of perhaps a secondary theme here. Perhaps a theme that I've self-appointed here is that, which self-appointing in John is probably a theme in itself. But what we've been talking about throughout the book of John is a group of people who are actively about missing the point, right? The disciples miss the point when Jesus is healing, or when he's talking to the Samaritan woman. He says, they come up at the end of the story and says, are you hungry? And Jesus says to them, my food is to do the work of my Father who sent me. And then the Pharisees come in in the middle and the end of John chapter 9, and they begin to debate whether the man who was blind, who Jesus has healed, is actually the man who was blind. Perhaps he was somebody else. Perhaps this is all a ruse, or a magician's thing that's happening in Las Vegas, a bait and switch type of moment here. And it's adventures in missing the point here. But Jesus has shown himself, as we've been talking about, greater than Moses when he walked on the water. He provided bread and for the thousands of people and fish, and they missed that this is exactly what Isaiah has been telling them about and telling them what happened. For this is the purpose for which the Messiah had come. This is not just something that Jesus was randomly doing for the sake of he needed something to keep himself busy during his 3 years of ministry. No, this is what the prophets said that the Messiah would do. And now as Jesus heals the lame man, the blind man, we see that Jesus again is fulfilling the prophets. And the major theme of the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, if we go back and we track on the chart, and we were to create a chart, we see that Jesus' 3 years of ministry is actively rolling back the brokenness that's been in the world since the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Think about that with me for a moment. He's actively rolling back the pain and the suffering and the brokenness. He's actively displaying not just the glory and the deity of God, but he's actively displaying the kingdom of heaven on earth. Remember the Lord's Prayer? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus is actively displaying the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven, as he's actively, through the healing of the man by the pool, through the making of the wine at the wedding feast, now through the healing of the blind man, he's opening their eyes to not just their blindness or their spiritual condition, but through the blindness that's been apparent throughout all of Old Testament history. It's something that is more of a natural condition. And he's rolling back the brokenness and the pain that's present and evident because of the fall. Because of the fall, and he's demonstrating the kingdom present. And then when he speaks to the Samaritan woman, he demonstrates the message, the desire for the gospel to go, not just to be to to a small group of people, but the gospel to spread to those beyond the temple, not just to those in Jerusalem, but to those who have been cast aside, even to those in the lowliest of places. So if we were to spend our time this morning examining the end of John 9, which unfortunately because of time and because you guys want to eat lunch later, we're not going to do that. But if we were to do that, if we were to go back to John chapter 9, we would notice the great debate has arisen about Jesus healing the blind man. A debate perhaps even greater than we dipped our feet into last week about who sinned and why sin was important. For the Pharisees did not want to accept the reality that Jesus had actually healed a man, especially a man that all of them knew, a man that had been sitting at the gate of the temple for years. They denied that this man was actually blind. They denied that he had been healed, and in the end, they ended up kicking him out of the temple. Again, we go back to what Jesus is addressing here in John chapter 10. And so what happens in John chapter 9 is they end up kicking the man out of the temple. And so we come back to John chapter 10. Jesus is saying, if you're people who are supposed to be leaders in the temple, your main care or your main purpose is loving and caring for the people. Well, in John chapter 9, we see why he does this, because in John chapter 9, they kicked the man out of the temple. Well, if you're about the people of God and you have the heart of God, you're supposed to be caring for people, not de-synagoguing them, if that's a word. Y'all can debate that later at lunch. I'm giving you all lunch topics to talk about here. So they kick him out of the temple. They say, you're not welcome to worship here. So they remove him from fellowship because he's causing such a great ruckus. And it was better for him to be gone than to stay part of what was happening. So this brings us to where we are now in John chapter 10. And we can almost feel the tension. And it's a bit palpable here. And John gives us the words of Jesus here. Notice in John chapter 10, opening words here, the first two words, Jesus says, truly, truly. Now, in our words, this is like saying, hey, enough. Legitimately, this is a call to end the debate. It's as if Jesus is saying, be done with this. I mean, if you're a grandfather, if you're a dad, and your kids are kind of having a ruckus at the table and it's time to get together, you're like, stop. Be done with the nonsense. Because here we remember in John chapter 9, verse 4, we were last week, Jesus tells the disciples, he says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming. Remember in John chapter 9, in the very first part of the chapter, he says, this is not a time for theological debate. This is a time for work because night is coming. So in John chapter 10, remember there's really no chapters going on when the Bible was originally put together. He says, enough of this. This is not a time for debate. This is distracting from the mission and the purpose of why we are here. We are to be about the works of Dad. We are to be about the purpose of the kingdom, not about debating the means and the methods or about all this theology. This is a distraction. It's confusing people. Jesus is calling for attention, and now he's going to address their hearts directly. And so we move forward, and he says, I say to you in verse 1, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door but climbs in by another way, that man... Notice this, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. Friends, the weight of this passage, Jesus is stopping the debate, he's stopping the bickering, and he at the core is addressing the reality of what is and what has been going on. Jesus calls out the false teachers on their face, and he calls out the leaders of the temple, and he calls out the Pharisees and the scribes, those who have been responsible for interpreting and imposing the laws on the people. And the problem with all this, the problem with the people, as they established here, is they had not been appointed by God, but they had put themselves in this position. They had decided on their own merits that they were good enough to be the ones imposing the laws on everybody else and keeping everybody else to their standards. They had put themselves in this position. They didn't know God. They didn't know God at all. And they obviously, from what we see at the end, in the middle of John chapter 9, they weren't worshiping God. They didn't care anything about the sheep. They used the sheep. Now we see this from John 6 and 7, moving forward to 8. They used the sheep for their benefit and for their gain. They called them accursed and they cast them out whenever they disagreed with them, partly because they were insecure about their own position. Because if this man can be healed when he's blind, and he didn't have to pay for it. He didn't have to come and bring alms. He didn't have to come and pay for a sacrifice. He didn't have to bring an animal that he had to buy from us. It's going to ruin our temple system. Remember, we talked about the sacrificial system just a few chapters ago. If he didn't have to come and buy our animal and purchase it at a greatly increased rate, then you're going to completely ruin our system in here. If you're ruining our system, then our financial security is really going out the window here. So look at it from an extremely practical view here. If this is really going on, you're really hitting at the core of the leader's insecurity here, because how are they going to make a good living here? And so what Jesus is saying here is this is all self-appointed, and we're hitting at the core of an insecurity, of a self-appointed assumption to leadership. They lived in their own towers of self-glorification, and they loved nothing better than to hold their thumbs and their fingers and their power over everybody else, and they used their power to interpret the laws that made them better and everybody else worse, to keep them in favor with people and to keep everybody else out of favor with God so that they would keep making money. This was ridiculous. Ridiculous. And you say, well, you're making a lot of broad assumptions here. No, we're not. Look at chapter 9, and we see clearly the hearts of the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders. They do all they can to try to disprove what's happening here. They do all they can to try to disprove what Jesus is doing here. If they cared, if they were true shepherds of the flock of God, they would be concerned about caring for the flock, not throwing the guy out, caring for this man who was blind, not using him. In the end, they wouldn't have thrown him out. They would have brought him in. They wouldn't have pushed him away. They would have brought him in. Practically speaking, you would think that if they were true opportunists, they would post the guy on a billboard and use him to draw people in like you and I would have. Think about it. Guys healed from blindness. Everybody come to our temple. You know what I'm saying? That's a major marketing tactic right there. Everybody come to our temple, you might be healed of your blindness. I mean, people would be coming in droves. And you think I'm crazy, but churches in America do that. You come here, we will heal you a blank, blank, and blank. You come here and you will get rich by doing this, this, and this. Y'all think I'm crazy, but it's on late night TV. It comes on at 6 o'clock at night. Late night TV, you know what I'm saying? They have their own TV networks. You send money to this website, to this phone number, and you will be blessed. You buy this little rag, and you bow down and pray on it, then you will get this. So, y'all can interpret that yourselves. So we come now in John 10, and he's talking about shepherds. Why shepherds? Because when we look at shepherds, this would have been the normal course of life for those in Israel. Why? Because literally Israel would have been a similar landscape to this minus the irrigation. This would have not been out of the question because the ground was not great for growing things. So we have shepherds with sheep, and so the shepherds are moving their sheep to the fields. They're looking for grazing land. They're looking for place for the sheep to eat grass, and so they're moving about in their daily life. Shepherd is a normal life. It's a normal lifestyle. To think about it perhaps from a practical perspective, sheep. Now, get this. We've all heard sermons about sheep. We've seen books. We've seen illustration. We have when you have kids and grandkids, you talk about sheep being the cuddly little white things, but we all know they're dumb animals. But think about this for a minute. Think about this for a minute. Sheep were, pound for pound, the most valuable animals you could have had. Practically speaking, now you guys know I'm extremely practical. So when you think about it on the grassroots level, they're pound for pound the most valuable animals you could have had. You have wool that they grow. The skin is valuable, and then you have the meat. So pound for pound, a little fuzzy little sheep is the most valuable animal they could have had in modern day Palestine. The shepherds didn't have their money in a bank. They raised sheep. It was extremely practical. This was their treasure. So Jesus in John chapter 10 addresses a shepherd. Why? Because he's talking about a practical treasure here. People who were practically about guarding and looking at the most valuable thing of the time. So here Jesus is not flippant in choosing his language. He's not flippant in choosing the language of the shepherd. Why? Because he's talking about his children. The people of God. The most valued of all creation. We should not take this lightly from pointing out the hearts of the false teachers. He uses the illustration of the most valued, the one that you dearly care for, the one that you would give your all for. That's what he's talking about here. And here Jesus is contrasting. He's contrasting the hearts of the Pharisees with the hearts of the shepherds. There are so many lessons that you and I can gather from this. What is the nature of our heart? What is it that is most valued to us? How do we care for what we value? But here in this passage, Jesus is using shepherds to teach us not about what our value is necessarily, but how he values us, about what he values himself, to teach us about his care, about his love for his children, and ultimately about his deity. So before our minds wander to think about where we're putting our money right now, let's think about how Jesus is teaching us about what he values. And so the life of the Palestinian shepherd, think about this, wasn't an easy life. So when we start thinking about why Jesus is giving us this illustration, we remember that this life of a Palestinian shepherd would not have been an easy life. It would have been a life like we read about young David before he becomes the king, fending off the wild animals from attacking the flock. It would have been tending to wandering animals who by far are just wandering off because they don't herd well. So it would have been going after them and keeping them in a flock rather than animals who keep and require constant, diligent care. A shepherd had to maintain vigilance, fearless courage, patience, and love for his flock. These were necessary characteristics of a shepherd. He had to care for them, not just stand there. Not just stand there and watch them. In the Old Testament, God used this analogy. He calls himself the shepherd of Israel, and Israel his flock. The psalmist said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In Psalms, it says in Psalm 77, "You lead me, the people, like a flock." In Psalm 79 through 80, 79, verse 13 through 80, verse 1, it says, "But we, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will give thanks to you forever. From generation to generation, we will recount your praise. Restore us, O God." Psalms 80, verse 1, "Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock." And in Psalms 95, it says, "He is our God, and we are his people, of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand." We are the sheep, and he is the shepherd. God is the shepherd of the nation of Israel. God is the shepherd of his children. The same analogy carried itself forward in the New Testament. And Jesus Christ calls himself a shepherd and his own church, the church, his flock. He is the shepherd who will risk his life to seek and to save his lost sheep. Remember this in Matthew 18. He is the shepherd who has pity upon the people because they are sheep who have no shepherd. In Matthew 9, he is the shepherd who called his disciples a little flock in Luke 12. And when he, the shepherd, was smitten, you remember he says in Mark 14, quoting the Old Testament, when the shepherd was smitten, the sheep are scattered. And Peter says he is the shepherd of our souls. And the writer of Hebrews says he is the great shepherd of the sheep. The language here in John 10 is not a language that's just from a small nugget, but it's an all-encompassing picture. Friends, this is a picture of us understanding with certainty that this main point, that he alone is the true, good shepherd, and all the rest that are seeking our attention, seeking to drive us, seeking to direct us, are nothing but thieves and robbers. So let us listen. And in a world full of distractions, in a world full of name it and claim it gospels, in a world full of prosperity gospels and cults and do-it-yourself faiths, Jesus does not parse his words here. This is not an if-then statement. This is not an if-then statement. When he says in verse 6 of chapter 10, he says, "This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand it." This is not a parable by saying, perhaps. This is not an illustration. This is a simile. Jesus is saying, "I am." This is an absolute statement. Jesus is addressing the false teachers, those who are self-proclaimed, self-sustained. And in this moment, he's saying, "I am the shepherd. I am the only one who cares, who is good enough for the sheep." He is the one whom the prophets write about, whom the prophets say is coming, who the psalmist sings about. This, again, is not a parable. We need to understand that in verse 6, he's not talking in a parable. He's talking in a simile. He is like this. He is this. This is not what we would see in Luke or in the other Gospels. This is not Jesus saying, "I am like a shepherd." This is Jesus saying, "I am the good shepherd. I am the door." He goes on to say, "I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door but climbs in by other way is a thief and a robber. The shepherd who would come Get this picture of what's going on here. Why is he using these words? The shepherd would come to town, come to the villages with his sheep, and he would come to the entrance of the large sheepfold, which would house all the sheep. So the shepherds would be out grazing, and as darkness is coming, all the shepherds would come in at night. And they would perhaps come into the village if they weren't too far away, and they would come in and there would be a sheepfold in the village. And they would put all their sheep in. They would put all their sheep in. So we think about this for a moment. All the sheep from the herds of the village would be put into this sheep pen. So logically speaking, if you've ever dealt with animals, you're thinking like me that this is going to be a mess. All these not smart animals are in a pen. They're going to get mixed up. But how is the shepherd going to know which sheep is his? But they don't get mixed up. Notice this, because they all knew their own name. When their master spoke, we'll see this in a minute, the shepherd would bring all of his sheep to the door. They knew their name, and so when the shepherd would bring them to the door, he would take his rod, he would put it down over the door so low that the sheep couldn't get in. Notice what's happening here. He would take it and he'd put it over so the sheep couldn't get in, and the sheep would stop. And he would get down and he would check each individual sheep. And he would inspect them, and he would make sure that they weren't hurt and they weren't injured. And he did that every night with every sheep. And this is a sign, get this. So you can see this happening. He's bringing all the sheep in. He's tired. He's been out rounding up, keeping up with the sheep all day long. He brings them back into the sheepfold. He puts his rod down, the staff that we talk about. Every one of them had it. And he would put it down over the gate. He had all the sheep there. And they go to walk in. And he gets down. He starts inspecting every part of the animal to make sure they haven't been injured, that they're not hurt. He knows them intimately. He knows how to care for them. He knows what's going on. He knows that they have blemishes on them. He knows what's going on. He knows about his animals here. He knows how to care for them. Remember, why? Because these are animals of great value, of great worth to the shepherd. And we see, why does this matter? We look back to Ezekiel 20, verse 37. And I encourage you to go look this up this week. Ezekiel 20, verse 37 highlights why this is important. In Ezekiel 20, God says, someday I'm going to gather Israel and I'm going to bring Israel into the kingdom. And he says this in verse 37. In Ezekiel 20, 37, he says, I will make you, catch this, I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. So in Ezekiel 20:37, we have this whole prophecy about the same thing that's happening when Jesus is talking about the sheepfold, when the sheep are coming into the sheepfold. We have this whole thing being prophesied about when the prophet is speaking. He says, I'm going to bring you into the bond of the covenant. And he says, you're going to pass under the rod. What is this passing under the rod? It's this inspection. Why? Because we are the sheep and we are the most valued of all. And he says, I'm going to make you pass under. Why? Because he's going to inspect. Why? Because he dearly cares. He wants to know if we're hurt or blemish or something wrong here. Or because he's showing delicate care here. And so we see this. The shepherd of Israel is going to stop every sheep and check and make sure there's no scratch, no hurt, no injury. And we see the care that God has for his own. And so the shepherd would check his sheep and he became familiar with them. And the gatekeeper would accept the sheep. He would lock the gate and the shepherd would go home. And in the morning, the different shepherds would come and get their sheep and he would call them. He would call them by name and they would follow and they would go back out to the pasture, go back out to the field. Now we see this. Only the shepherd could get in through the door. The gatekeeper wouldn't let a thief or a robber in. Only the shepherd could get in through the door. And so the thieves and the robbers, in order to get in, they would have to climb the wall. We see in verse 1, if you get in by another way as a thief and a robber, but he who enters by the door is the shepherd. To him the gatekeeper opens, but the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. They couldn't get in the door because the gatekeeper wouldn't let them in. They couldn't get in. And so they would have to climb the walls to get into the sheep. But notice this. The shepherd would go into the door and the thieves would have to climb over the wall and get into the sheep they wanted to steal. So when we look at this with an understanding that this is not a parable, but rather this is a simile, Jesus is teaching in a manner to contrast the reality currently of what is going on in the temple, what we see happening specifically in John chapter 9, to what's happening in John chapter 9. Jesus is using this to contrast what is being taught, how the sheep are being treated by the self-appointed leaders. What do the sheep represent here? What do the sheep represent here? Who do the sheep represent? And who are the robbers and the thieves? Well, Let's start with the sheepfold. The sheepfold is Israel. The sheepfold is Israel. And when we look at the sheep perhaps are the Jews. So the sheepfold is Israel, the sheep are the Jews, and all through Israel's history, false shepherds. This is what Jesus is saying. False shepherds have come and taken the sheep, fleeced the sheep, and the only rightful shepherd, the one who has the messianic authority to come in the door and take his sheep, his children, and lead them out of Judaism, is Jesus. Think about that for a moment. We can go back to the time of Moses. When Moses was up on the mountain bringing the covenant down, and some of them rose up and decided they were going to make a calf. We look at this and we can understand with a little bit more clarity here that some have come in and tried to take the sheep out. But also notice here that only some of God's children are in that sheepfold. We see this pointed out by Jesus in John 10:16. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them in also. And they, notice this, they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. And so we're saying some are in the fold, but we'll address this more in a few minutes. But here, right now, Jesus is the shepherd Messiah who comes to lead the Jewish people out of Judaism. Why? Because he's going to lead them into a new relationship with God through him and all of the false leaders of Israel who have been trying to impose the law, trying to climb the walls to impose their false messiahship, their false salvation through the law, saying you can earn your salvation by doing blank, blank, and blank. You can earn your salvation by buying our animals, by sacrificing this. You can do this. They're thieves and robbers. But here now is the rightful shepherd, and his name is Jesus. And we see that in John 10:2. He who enters by the door, he is the shepherd of the sheep. And this imagery of the door, the shepherd who enters by the way of the door, the one who has the right to lead the people out of Israel. Notice this, he has the right to lead the people out of Israel. Why? Because nobody else has the messianic right to go in the door and lead out God's children. But Jesus himself, he comes in, why? The right way. He comes in because he has fulfilled the messianic promises. He was the virgin-born Son of God. He was declared to be so by the Father. Remember, when he was baptized, he says, "This is my Son, whom I well pleased." He was declared to be so by his words and by his works. John 1. He was declared to be so by John the Baptist and the testimony of others. Jesus conformed to every promise of the prophets. He is the rightful shepherd, the one sent from the Father to take the children of God, to lead them out of their Judaism, their faith, their belief, and to be his people, and to be his church. Remember, we are leading to Acts. We are leading to where they are the church of God, sent out for the mission of God, to be the people of God, to bring the gospel to all peoples and all nations. That's what they're being sent out. Let us not miss the warning that Jesus is giving here. There are thieves, though. There are thieves and there are robbers and those who are desperately seeking to deceive. Very clearly in John 8-10, we see the self-appointed religious leaders arguing over semantics, positioning themselves for power and to rule, missing the gospel. They're missing the kingdom, rather seeking power and seeking riches and wealth and the submission of those who need to and who they desire to follow them. But here Jesus comes in and says, no, it's not about that. It's about the fact that I come and I fulfill everything since Genesis 3:15 all the way through Malachi. And now I show up in Matthew, and I am not just part of the equation. I am the equation. I am enough. I am it. I am him who has come to bring and to restore the relationship with the Father. I am the Son of God. I am the Word made flesh. That's what he is saying here. Friends, there are no less thieves and robbers present today in our lives than there were when Jesus was making this statement in John chapter 10. And the problem with today, opposed to John chapter 10, is we provide them a multitude, an infinite multitude of mediums to have access to globalization of their thievery and their robbers, whatever that word is. But we give them ultimate access to the world through a multitude of mediums. Those who claim to be preachers and prophets and those who claim to lead prosperity and peace, they're missing the intentionality of living out the gospel. This was the teaching that we had a couple of weeks ago at Secret Church here in this very room. You can have part of the gospel and leave out some elements of the gospel, and you make yourself a cult. You can't go light on the gospel. Anything light on the gospel, the only thing it does is lead us to hell. It's either all the gospel or none of the gospel. You don't get to choose, well, I like Jesus like this. If I can just have some of Jesus over here, but not all of Jesus, because if I have all of Jesus, then he's going to demand that I do my life like this. Well, it's either all or nothing. We don't get to choose parts of Jesus, parts of the gospel, parts of this. That's what the Pharisees were doing. That's what Jesus is teaching against right here. We get all of him or none of him, because if we get some of him, then it's counterfeit. It's all or nothing. And we see this warning that Jesus gives us in Matthew chapter 25. And he says in Matthew 25:13, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." What a statement. False shepherds stealing the sheep of Israel and turning them into children of hell. Literally damning the sheep who are the false shepherds, stealing over the walls and slaughtering the sheep. We see this picture of people leading others astray. Friends, that's why the Bible teaches that not many of us should be teachers and leaders, and not many of us should desire to do this, because there's going to be a judgment for this. There's going to be accountability for this. Nothing from God ever justified their mission. They weren't in this thing because of God. They appointed themselves on their own whims and on their own desires, and the rule over the sheep was not that of a tender, loving shepherd. It was treacherous, and it was painful, and it was abusive. It was about their own insecurities and how they built themselves up from their own pride. It was about themselves. And Jesus says in contrast, Jesus says this in contrast. He says, "I am the shepherd. I came through the door. I have the right to enter the fold of Israel, to gather my children, and to lead them out." Friends, let us bask in the glory and the care that we find in this passage in verse 3. In verse 3 it says, "The gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own by name, and he leads them out." Believers, do we recognize the significance of verse 3? He calls them by name and he leads them out. God's speaking, his sheep, his valued, hear him. This is kind of the response in John 9 when he puts the mud on the face, and we say, why did he even need to use mud? He could have just said, "Be healed," and the guy would have been healed, but he's expecting a response of obedience. And here in John chapter 10 and verse 3, he calls his by name, and they hear him, and he leads them out, so they follow him out. And so here this morning, listen to this. If you're a believer this morning, he calls you by name. It's not just a blanket call of salvation, just, "Hey, everybody at Booklift this morning, you're going to be saved." No, he calls us by name. He knows us intimately by name. And does the gospel get any better than this morning? If you're struggling with doubt, or you're struggling with insecurity, or you're not a believer, you can know this for certain, that when God calls you, it's not a blanket call of everybody in this household, everybody in that household. It's an intimate call of him knowing you by name, knowing your heart, knowing your desires. He says, "You are my child. You're not just somebody living in Grand Junction in this period of time on this day." He says, "I know you. I know who you are. I know where you are, and you're not just somebody. You are mine." And he said, and you say, "Well, perhaps he doesn't really know me because I'm a broken, really bad person." Oh, no. He knows your name, so he definitely knows all of your brokenness and all your pain. He says, "I got this. I've got this. I know you." God is not about working randomly. God is not passive in his work, but God works specifically, calling his children specifically. He knows their names. He knows their desires. And get this, it's not just about God working specifically. It's not just about God knowing their names. They recognize his voice. Think about this. When you give your testimony, your story about how God has been working in your life, you say, "I knew God was doing this. I responded to the call of salvation." Yes, because you heard and you recognized the voice of God. It's not like you had to tune in the radio frequency. It's not like you had the Verizon commercial. Did you hear me now? No. You recognize the voice of God. It's not like you had to be in the right place at the right time so the lightning could strike you just at the right point. Even though sometimes some of you, I'm like, we're going to throw some real hard lightning bolts. No. You recognize the voice of God. When the Spirit of God is working in your life, you recognize it. And you say, you're full of it. No, I'm not. Look at John 20. Mary goes looking for the body of Jesus, and she thinks she's talking to the gardener because she thinks, where did y'all put his body? And she's talking to him saying, where is he? She thinks they misplaced the body of Jesus. And what happens? The gardener turns around and says, Mary. In that one word, the one word, Mary completely loses her mind. Why? Because in that one word, she recognizes that it's not a gardener, but it's Jesus. And she refers back to him, Rabboni. And she tries to attack him. That's Chad's interpretation of the verse. But you know what I'm saying? She goes to hug him. Y'all think I'm crazy? Go look it up. But literally, Jesus' response to her is, do not cling to me right now because I haven't gone to my Father and come back yet. Why? Because she recognizes his or her name. She recognizes his voice. In John 20:16, she recognizes it. The people of God recognize his voice, but it's not just that. They follow him. And we think about this. Okay, you think I'm blowing this up for no reason. But in Western culture, when we do this whole shepherding act, we get sheepdogs. I mean, that's where the shepherd class of dogs come from, because we get behind them and we run the animals. So, I mean, literally, we get them going where they need to go. But here, notice this. He leads them and they follow him. He leads them so that he gets into danger first. They're not going someplace where he hasn't been before. And this is a hugely, massively important thing for us, because we say, well, Jesus doesn't have a clue what's going on in my life right now. Yeah, he does, because he's leading you first. He's going to know if we're coming to a cliff, and then he's going to turn and he's going to lead us a different way. He's leading us and we're following. He's leading and the sheep are following. He walks in front of the sheep, warding off dangers, looking for those who would seek to attack and devour. He is going in front. He's not behind with the stick. He's not like us with most of our kids. You get out of line, you know what I'm saying? He's not like that. He's going in front. And they follow because they know his voice. They know he's calling and he knows their names. And just as the blind man responded by washing, they respond and he leads them out. And so that's massively important, because it shows a level of care and intimacy for the sheep, for the most valued, for those who he cares dearly for. So we look quickly this morning at verses 7. And so Jesus says to them, truly I say to you, truly, truly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep, and all who came before me. Now this is a completely different teaching moment. Verses 1 through 6 are one teaching moment. Verses 7 through 16 are a different teaching moment. So these don't. Okay, they're two different teaching similes here, so we need to understand that. It says, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep, and all who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal, to kill, and destroy, and I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. Now notice this, verse 16, I have other sheep, not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, so there will be one flock. And there will be one shepherd. This lesson doesn't end with just the sheep following the shepherd out of the pen in the village. No, Jesus goes on and he teaches this separate lesson here, beginning in verse 7, a lesson about sheep who are out, who have come out of the sheepfold. This is a lesson about what happens once you leave the religion, once you start following him. What does it mean to do life with Jesus now? For this lesson, this is about us going on, the practical lesson here. For oftentimes the shepherd is in search for food, and so they're out on this journey. And so, we talked about earlier, the sheepfold is for those who are not too far out at the end of the day and they come in. But what happens when you're far out? What happens when you're far out and you can't come back into the village, into the sheepfold? And so this is what Jesus is saying here. we're not going back in. And so you say, we look at this and we say, this is perhaps what happens on the night when the angels visit the shepherds on the side of the hill on the night that Jesus was born. I mean, this is perhaps they were too far out from the village to bring their sheep back in, or perhaps the village was just overpopulated and they couldn't come back in because the sheepfold was full of animals, or full of people. And so perhaps this is what's going on here. And we see that this is a direct illustration of the shepherd, again, caring for his people and what's going on here. This is practical. The shepherds would lead their sheep off into the crevice or a rock or a place where they could keep them from wandering off aimlessly. And remember, the sheep are sometimes mindless animals. At the same time, Jesus is referring to us. So at night, they can't come back into the sheepfold. He puts them in a place, the shepherd puts them in a place where he can protect them. A rock, a canyon, someplace where he can protect them. And notice how Jesus is teaching. He's comparing the shepherd to a hired hand this time. The good shepherd is the door to the sheep. Literally, the shepherd is going to place himself in the way of danger so that the sheep are protected. There is no one or nothing gaining access to the sheep without coming to or through the shepherd first. Think about that. Jesus is directly comparing himself to the hired hand. There's nothing required of a hired hand if animals come and attack the sheep and they're killed. He doesn't have to pay something if he runs off. He doesn't have to give something back in restitution here. No, he can leave. It's fair game. But notice this, Jesus says the shepherd here is going to put himself as the gate. He's going to lay there. The shepherd is no hired hand who would flee danger, but rather the shepherd is the one who would, friends, notice this, give his life for his sheep. When it comes down to protecting the sheep, he does not leave it to chance, but rather he lays down. He himself is the door. He is the entrance to the sheep. He is access to the sheep. This, friends, is the picture of the kingdom. This is the picture of what it means to be the children of the king. The king is protecting the children. The king is providing for his children. He says, I love my sheep so much that when the wolves come, I become, notice this, when the wolves come, I become the lamb myself. When it says, I lay down my life for the sheep, this is no little word. You can't get it across in English the way it comes across here in this Greek language, for it says, in place of. When the wolves come, I give my life in place of these sheep. So Jesus is saying, I am the shepherd who becomes. Notice this in John 10, who becomes the sacrificial lamb. I am the shepherd that when the wolf comes, I would lose anything than lose my sheep. I would lose my life. I would lose my glory. I would lose the universe rather than see the sheep perish. This is beautiful. Because this is what it means to care. Not only does he know their names, not only is he intimately about hearing them and they knowing his voice, but we see that in this moment he says, I am going to put my life in their place, and the Son of God is saying, I am a shepherd and you are the sheep. And the reality of being a sheep means we're desperately in need of a shepherd in this world, and we need a good shepherd, for this world is full of those who would desire to lead us astray, and we can't do anything on our own. That's the reality, is we can't protect ourselves. This second major point here is if he's the shepherd, we are the sheep, then we are his treasure. And if we are his treasure and he owns everything in this world, and he owns the universe and all the planets and the solar system and the galaxy, he owns everything and all the gold and all the wealth and all the treasure. But he says, I have bound my heart with your heart. I am ready to die for you. And we know the end of the story. He dies for us. Isaiah 53 tells us that when he was on the way to the cross, Isaiah 53 says he was oppressed and afflicted, but he didn't open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before his shearers is silent. So was he on the cross. What was he thinking? Psalms 22 says, on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalms 22 informs John 10. He was thinking about the whole of Psalms. In Psalms we read, roaring lions open their mouths wide against me. Dogs surround me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. When he was on the cross, we get the imagery that's spoken in Psalms that comes alive in John 10. It was wolves coming. He quotes Psalms 22 because he's saying, get this, Psalms 22 points us to the imagery of wolves and dogs coming to ravage the sheep. And in John 10, we understand why. Because in John 10, he says, I lay my life down for my sheep. And in John 10, he points us forward to the cross where he says, I am dying for my lamb. I am dying for my lamb. I am the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. This has never been a stronger statement about love. Never been a stronger statement about love. There's never been a stronger affirmation of any person's value than to hear this. Jesus looks into our hearts all the way to the bottom and he says, I see something infinitely precious in you. I see something infinitely precious in all of us. Friends, notice this. This is the gospel. This is the gospel. We've had a whole lot of fun this morning with John 10, but don't miss the importance of this part. He sees all of us. Sheep are not a mindless illustration here, but we are mindless. We can't do things on our own. When Jesus looks down and we complain, and we talk about this often at Bookcliff, and we say, if only we had the full scope of what was going on. It's just like us correcting our children when they want to do something that's dangerous. Jesus is looking down at us and he's saying, you don't know the picture. You don't see the vastness of the glory of what I'm orchestrating here. When we make fun of sheep and think they're just but dumb animals, and we can put ourselves in this picture and we can say, but we're just but dumb animals. But look at this. We're just but dumb animals who have been claimed and restored and adopted, inspected, and called by name. He says, I see something infinitely precious in us. This whole passage, for the most part, is about God calling the Jews out of their oppression from Judaism and the temple. But notice this, and we're just going to touch this, and we don't have time to dive into this. But verse 16, this is about us. We think the gospel doesn't go to the Gentiles perhaps until Matthew 28 or until Acts. But it's right here in John 10:16. He says, I have other sheep that are not of this fold, and I must bring them in. Why? Look at those very next words. They will listen to me. Period. There will be one flock. Period. There will be one shepherd. Friends, we're all, I think, Gentiles in this room. But this message of the saving gospel is for all of us in this room as well. All of us. Here's where we're included in the picture, for we too need to be delivered from our bondage to slavery. Yes, you're right. None of us were in the temple. None of us were experiencing the affliction of the Pharisees, I hope. But all of us have the affliction of something else. Perhaps you've come from a church or a background where you've had some other cult, some prosperity gospel, some Mormonism, some Jehovah's Witness, some one of the other 30,000 dozen variations on the gospel that there are. Know this morning. Jesus comes and he says, I am the good shepherd. I am the way. And friends, we need to understand this. Every one of us needs to be freed from our bondage to slavery, from our worship of idols, from our deception. Friends, this morning, hear the promise that we are brought into the fold, and it is the plan of the King to make us his, to call us by name, to know us intimately, so that we may be known as sons and daughters of the King, as princes and princesses of the kingdom. This is the contrast. This is what it means to be loved by God, that we should worship Him, that we should know what worship is, that we should know and to be known by God, not to live in fear or manipulation. This is not about manipulation. This is about love. This is about freedom. This is about grace. The love and the care and the protection and the grace of the King. Let us know that this morning. Let us know freedom. Let us know worship this morning. Psalms 100. Know that the Lord, He is God. It is He who made us, and we are His. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and His faithfulness to all generations. Let's pray this morning.